If turkey is the star of your Thanksgiving table, then might I suggest prime rib for your New Year's Eve celebration. As I've been getting older, I've been more and more into staying in on New Year's Eve, inviting people over and having this as a friends forward holiday gathering thingy. If you're still young and vibrant and full of hope and optimism, as well as patience for waiting in traffic, then by all means, go to whatever city downtown center square thingy is doing your countdown where you're gonna watch some balls drop. I highly recommend it. Everybody should always at least do that once. But for many of us olds, New Year's Eve is nothing more than just amateur hour for people who drink. Being stuck outside in crowds, oftentimes wet and cold, is just not something that appeals to us anymore. So now, might I suggest a different New Year's Eve tradition where you invite some of your closest friends over for some drinks, some food, and then the countdown if you manage to stay up that long. Think of the New Year's Eve dinner as the Golden Globes of the holiday dinner circuit, the sassier, boozier, funnier cousin to the way more serious Oscars and the even more serious People's Choice Awards. Maybe for this first round you don't even do a dinner. Maybe you just get like a giant charcuterie board with some champagne or something else sparkling and bubbly for people who don't drink, and you just have yourselves a good time in the comfort of your own home while watching the countdown on TV together. If you're anyone like me, you've been out for plenty of New Year's Eve celebrations, or maybe you've even worked plenty of New Year's Eve celebrations, and now you just want to chill with friends at home. And that's why I suggest the prime rib. Now, it might seem pretty intimidating to handle such an expensive hunk of meat, but I'm here to assure you that you can do this. If we take things low and slow, we will minimize the chances of you making any kind of mistake, and armed with the right tools, we will make this into something that seems way more manageable, but extremely impressive. Let's get started. Now, just some quick facts to begin with. There are generally two different cuts that you can get when selecting a prime rib. The first cut and the second cut. And the differences between these exactly which ribs of the cow you are selecting. If you're choosing the first cut, you're choosing the cuts between rib 10 and rib 12. And if you're choosing the second cut, you're choosing anywhere from ribs 9 to rib 6. The first cut is closer to the loin, while the second cut is closer to the chuck. And while the first cut tends to be smaller, it is more tender, and the second cut larger, but with more flavor. The first cut is generally more expensive if your butcher is differentiating between the two. Once you start doing this enough, it is more down to your own preference. If you know me, you know that I love a chuck roast because I like to cook things low and slow, and I love the more beefier, flavorful cuts, and therefore I am perfectly happy with a second cut. One of the reasons why the second cut is not as tender as the first cut is that it has more connective tissue, which again is something that is negated with long cooking time. But because we're going to use a reverse sear or a reverse broil method for this roast, that extra toughness will be negated by the fact that we're using low temperatures at an increased amount of time, because we are going to have a lot of enzymic breakdown during that time, meaning that this thing will be tender and juicy and delicious and more flavorful. Now, the first thing we're going to do, we're going to remove the rib parts of the prime rib. We're gonna cut off the bones along its longest sides. And the reason we're doing that is that so we can get complete coverage when it's time to season the meat. You should definitely buy your prime rib 2 or 3 days before the cooking date so it can have 24 to 48 hours of dry brining under some salt. Not only does this help dry off the surface a little bit, which makes it easier to char and sear and get a gorgeous crust, but it also enhances the flavor. The salt will draw out moisture from the meat, mix in with that water, and then get absorbed back in, and it needs 24 to 48 hours to do that. 48 is ideal. So it is pretty easy here. You can see right around here where the bones are, and you just kind of cut alongside the edge. Don't worry about getting it perfect, it just takes a little bit of practice. Now you simply just put this on any kind of tray. So you just salt liberally on all sides of the meat. And remember, you're doing this 2 days before the day that you're actually going to cook. Now, very likely your prime rib will have a good amount of fat on the top, and that is good. Don't trim that off. But to make it a little bit better when it comes time to cook it, you can go ahead and you can score the fat off so that when it cooks and broils, it renders off more beautifully over every part of your prime rib. So there we go. I'm using Diamond Crystal Kosher salt, which if you're in the restaurant industry, you know is extremely forgiving. If you're using plain table salt, you might not want to use so much, but this is fine. All right, with it salted, we're just gonna stick this in the fridge for 48 hours, and then we'll be back to cook the thing. It has been 48 hours since we dry brined and seasoned this prime rib. And this is the ideal amount of time that a prime rib would spend in your fridge uncovered before cooking. Not only has the salt had the opportunity to release the moisture from the surface of the prime rib, absorb with that moisture and be absorbed back in for a much more flavorful roast, but the surface has had some time to dry as well. You can see kind of the texture of it here. Today is the day that we're going to cook and eat this prime rib, so now at this point we are going to assemble the crust. Here we have lots of pepper. This is almost 1/3 cup. A 1/4 cup of coriander, 2 tablespoons of thyme. This is 1 tablespoon of chopped rosemary. This is a mixture of fresh and dry oregano. I was going to use just fresh, but if I did, I feel like I would kill that plant. And so I cut it with some dry stuff, and I feel like that's okay. Drug dealers do this all the time, so like we should be able to as well. The coriander is whole, but we will crush this kind of very lightly the same way that we will crack black pepper. These two parts here, the black pepper and the coriander, are flavor elements, yes. Aromatic elements, yes, but they are mostly textural elements. The crust is going to be crusty because of these 2 ingredients. It'll be pleasantly crunchy and it'll give it a nice crisp flavor. And as the experiment, I've got some Chinese 5-spice here. I'm going to add maybe a tablespoon of this to the whole thing to see if it adds any kind of aromatic sweetness that I liked. This is my base crust, and I always like to add one little unknown element to see what it does to the whole thing. The last time I used cumin, did not really care for that so much, so this time I'm gonna do Chinese 5-spice. Picking rosemary is pretty simple. You just take it by the sprig and you take the top and you kind of like just, well, there we go. That's me then. That one didn't work as well. You just take the sprig and you kind of just like work your way down and kind of like, you know, I don't know what this motion would be called, but you kind of like just take off the leaves that way. If you have any green stems in your picked rosemary, that is generally okay. It's not ideal, but it's fine. What you really want to avoid in your chopped rosemary mix is any of the brown stems, because that is the woody part, and that is unpleasant to have in your mouth. So just pick your rosemary leaves off the stems and chop it nice and fine. Rosemary, oregano, and thyme are actually a great combination of herbs to have with any kind of roast, because the rosemary gives you your high piney notes, while the oregano adds in some sweetness and the thyme has like a nice fresh earthiness to it. They complement each other very well, and that's why they're oftentimes used together. But I really love them in a roast. Now for the pepper and the coriander. So the pepper, we are going to just lightly crack. And the difference between cracked, crushed, and fine black pepper is simply just the size of the pepper when you're processing it. So here, I just kind of like am being super light. I don't want pepper powder, but at the same time, I don't want like large, huge mouthfuls of whole pepper either. Same goes for the coriander. We're just going to lightly crack this. And what the coriander does is it adds a nice little pop, a very pleasant, crisp crunch to your crust. But instead of having it being like warm and aromatic, this part will be like fruity and bright. Coriander has a nice, pleasant sweetness in its aroma. It's almost like Fruit Loops to me in a way, but like in a way that works with roasts. And so I like having both because they do the same thing texturally, but aromatically, it's an extremely different experience. This we won't fry because coriander is so delicate that, you know, it will cook nicely just by roasting in the oven. Now, frying the oil is relatively simple. I just have some oil here at 350 to 400 degrees, and I dump in my crushed black pepper. And the amount of time that this takes is more of a visual thing than it is like an exact science. I'm looking for brown bits of black pepper. All of the parts of the black pepper that were white should become a toasty brown. This can take anywhere between a few minutes to 10 minutes, depending on how hot your oil is or how large your pieces of black pepper are. And you can actually test for doneness by taking one of the larger pieces of black pepper from the bottom, because those are going to be the most substantial parts that you have. And of course, let it cool a little bit before trying it out for yourself. There we are. It's ready. And the time it took me to film this part from start to finish was less than 5 minutes. So I would definitely say around like the 4-minute mark is when you should start checking. Over here I have a chinoise as well as a coffee filter, and just pouring the oil over the coffee filter to get all of the pepper. Now, I wouldn't save the leftover oil for anything. It would be very, very strong and peppery, but not necessarily all that flavorful. So I kind of just use like decently like frying oil for this. If you got any like frying oil that's still like pretty good, I would use it for this. All right, so now I have here everything that I need to just assemble my crust. And that's really all I'm gonna do. I've got my fried pepper, add in my coriander, add in my herbs, as well as my little spice experiment over here. I think this is gonna be good. Give this a mix. And now we are going to take the roast, remove the bone part that we cut off earlier, and we're going to brush it with an egg wash. And now you can use whatever you want. I like an egg wash because I feel like it's strong. Egg white is like such a binding protein that I know the crust is not going to come off or melt off. In fact, once it cooks with the egg wash on it, it's going to like make the bond of the crust even stronger. So that is what I want. And so that's why I prefer to use egg white over other stuff. No matter what you do, you definitely want to focus on the top and bottom because that is the part that everybody gets a slice of. Now the final step here is to reassemble the roast. The bone of a prime rib is actually quite important to the roast itself because the bone acts as a heat shield to the bottom of the roast, and it protects your prime rib from the more extreme parts of your oven during cooking. But if you're going to do it, then you're going to take some butcher's twine. Take more than you need while your hands are clean. Coming in underneath. Now, if you have been with me since Thanksgiving, you'll know the 4-loop trick that we use. You do the first loop like you're tying your shoe, and then one more time. And what that does, like this is like the tie your shoe loop. And this is what I call like the butcher's loop, because once you tighten it, it stays tight, secure, and quite pretty, I would say. Cut off the excess, because any kind of excess string can burn. So that is your tied off prime rib. Yeah. All right, elevated roasting tray on a rack. V-rack if you've got it. I don't, surprisingly. On cooking your prime rib, there are many ways that people like to do it. Some like to do a blast of heat at front and then slow cook afterwards. Some people like to do a pan sear first and then put it in the oven. I just follow Kenji's method of super low and slow as your oven can handle. So in my case, I have a 150-degree oven that I will put in there and put in a meat thermometer until it reads internals at 125. And then you will have a resting period of 30 minutes up to 2 hours. and then a final blast for like 17 minutes, under 20 minutes at 500 degrees plus, as hot as your oven can go. What I'm gonna use is this. I have this Chef IQ, unsponsored, but I bring this out every Thanksgiving, every New Year's, every holiday, because frankly, it's great. You just stick this in to the thickest part of your roast, and then you set it on the phone, and it will alert you when the internals are done and whenever it's ready to cook. I ordered a different one from a different company, and I will be doing a review and comparing these two, but quite frankly, I am a huge fan of this Chef IQ thermometer. Now, the downside of this is that it does not produce a lot of drippings. So if you're gonna make gravy or au jus, you should definitely have a recipe for making something using broth and red wine. So let's just get this in the oven, and we will be back in a few hours. Unfortunately, with this low and slow method of cooking prime rib, you don't get a lot of pan drippings to make the au jus with. Think of au jus as a very light gravy of which to serve prime rib. So I have a quick way of just making my own really fast au jus. Here I've got some trimmed beef fat and meat from a prime rib that I had previously made and frozen. You can use ground beef or any kind of like leftover beef thing that you have. Basically, what we're gonna do with this is create some like fond at the bottom of a stainless steel pan, cook in some onions in there, and then deglaze it with some red wine and beef stock. Add some flour and butter, not in that order, and that's pretty much it. That's a quick au jus that we can make without using any pan drippings because we're not gonna have any. So let's just do that real quick. So here we're just gonna add this in. And the point of this is to get some nice crusty bits at the bottom. We want that. If you don't have enough beef fat in here, you can always supplement with oil. But once this has started, I'm just gonna do just a touch of flour to make like a very loose roux. You don't wanna add too much flour. We're not trying to make a thick gravy, no more than like half a tablespoon to a tablespoon, depending on how much you're making. Now keep cooking it all in here until the floury whiteness has turned into kind of like a toasty brown, a light toasty brown. You don't want your flour to be completely raw when you start making this stuff. Add in onions. We're just gonna deglaze it with some red wine, as well as some beef stock. And at this point, you can just simmer it to your desired level of thickness. Now, once your consistency and the flavors are pretty much like almost there, you can go ahead and strain this out into a saucepan. And you can finish this off with any kind of last-minute seasoning you want. A tablespoon of butter, some salt, a touch of black pepper. Ooh, and there you go. You can just leave this to simmer until your prime rib is done and just serve this along with your meat. All right, now with the internal temperature registering at 120 degrees, I've removed it from the oven. And now this is where the beauty of this method comes in. I can just kind of sit pretty at this time and just wait till my guests arrive and everyone's ready to eat, and just put this in a broiling oven or just a blast roast as high as you can get, 500 degrees, 550 degrees, for like 8 minutes, just to get the crust sizzling hot, and then you're ready to serve. But at the very least, your prime rib needs 30 minutes to rest. You only need to do it once. You might as well get it done now after you blast it in the broiler and get this thing nice and browned. You can serve it up pretty much right away. All right, so just ignore my baking station here. So I'm going to use this oven just because it preheats more quickly. Unfortunately, it only goes up to 480 degrees, but we're gonna make do and keep it in here for maybe 4 minutes. 480 degrees with a super convection fan should be okay. And there you go. 7 minutes is all you need to achieve a nice toasted, crusty exterior. All that's left to do now is pretty much just take off the string. And you have a perfectly medium rare prime rib that looks absolutely gorgeous. And that is all that there is to it. As daunting as this piece of meat might be, don't be afraid of it. It is worth your time. It is worth the time it takes to learn how to do this right, to learn how to do it properly. Take it low and take it slow, and you're gonna do great. That's it. I'm gonna eat this now.